Okay, well, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who is Julie Walsh. Julie is a Global Research Fellow at the University of Warwick and a psychoanalyst in private practice. Her first book, Narcissism and Its Discontents, was published in 2015. Julie has a particular interest in thinking psychosocially about clinical work. She is a member of the Site for Contemporary Psychoanalysis and of the College of Psychoanalysts in the UK. And she also convenes the British Sociological Association's study group for sociology, psychoanalysis, and the psychosocial. I'm proud to say Julie is also a friend and training buddy. And she's going to be speaking under the wonderful title, Phallus, schmallus, ich bin die Brust, establishing the lines between transgender feminisms. Julie.
Thank you, Andy. And I'll reiterate Barry's wider thanks to our conference organisers for hosting this important and exciting event. I'm really very pleased to be here. Is my voice travelling to the back of the room? Great. We'll trust it's travelling to the other room as well then. Small point to start on. My title, rather than establishing some lines between, is drawing some lines through. And I say that because the establishing lines between indicates a kind of territorial figuration of the landscape, which is one that I'm certainly not interested in developing myself. Drawing some lines through, I hope, could be seen more as lines of communication. We'll see how we get on. Agreeing to speak at this conference was a slightly dangerous move for someone who's a bit phobic around categories. Categories are always a way of speaking about identity. To categorise is to endeavour to make intelligible a particular object of knowledge, to set it apart from that which it may be close to, but ultimately isn't the same as. To categorise is to demarcate the identifying characteristics of a thing, to say something like, I know you now that I can name you. This means that to invest in categories is to be constantly vulnerable to making a category error, or at the very least, falling into a category confusion. Confusion is the organising theme of my paper. In many ways, it's had to be. But I'm less interested in the purported confusion of the trans individual whose alignment with gender, sex expectations is deemed to require ever greater expert elucidation, psychoanalytic or otherwise. I'm more interested in the breadth, depth, and frequent ferocity of cultural confusions that emerge when trans subjects are given their airtime. One particularly confusing area of debate, especially when those involved seem so certain in their knowledge, concerns the relationship between trans positions and feminist positions, where the site of confusion is womanhood itself. Most psychoanalysts, I'd venture, and by the way, if I'm wary of categories, it's in part because I'm wary of generalisations. However, most psychoanalysts, I'd suggest, are going to be advocates for a degree of confusion. Not the torturous, paralysing kind that prohibits movement of body or mind, but the kind of confusion that signals a tolerance of ambiguity, perhaps a sensitivity to the faltering irresolutions behind identity statements. And, I want to suggest, advocates of a mode of confusion that attends to a capacity to bear the inevitable not knowing that accompanies the problem of sex. The not of sex. I'm spelling not with a K. How we do it, how it undoes us. Sex, you'll notice, the three-letter word that I've begun to use here, is not the lead signifier of our conference. It's worthy of note, I think, and I hope we bear it in mind over the course of our discussions, that gender appears twice in our conference title. First as a compound noun with the prefix trans, then as a standalone term. I'm interested in this configuration. Gender, one way or another, seemed to provide the tonic note, the term around which our conversation promises to convene itself. And yet here I am, beginning to talk about sex. Now, although it's a rudimentary point to emphasise, I'm going to emphasise it anyway. In the Freudian model, the dimensions of the unconscious are consubstantial with the not of sex, which is to say they're somehow made up of the same stuff, through the same processes. If, as Joan Kopczak puts it, sex is a stumbling block of sense, then the very idea that we can be secure or firmly fixed in our knowledge claims about it is thoroughly undermined. Indeed, we might take note of Denise Riley's observation, a theorist whose work I'll have more to say on shortly, and consider that there may be a form of sadism operating through the process of fixing an object, tying the knot too tightly. If it seems here that I'm evolving a story of fluidity, a commitment to loosening the knot, that's all well and good. But let's not forget that I began with a recognition, albeit a rather ambivalent one, regarding the persistent quality of categories, how they cannot not be attended to. I think there's something to say here about disciplinary logics. The categorising impulse of the sociologist, for example, derives, sensibly enough, from her object of study, social reality, where categories matter, the birth certificate, the school uniform, the navigation of public bathrooms, the bureaucratic and institutional forms through which private and intimate lives are shaped. To say that categories organise the experience of social reality, which is a sociologist's object of study, is to posit them as structures with histories that are worthy of scrutiny. Really, how has it come to pass that in the 1960s, my mother, so she tells me, was prohibited by the bank manager from opening an account in her own name on the grounds of her marital status, whereas now, in 2017, depending on who I bank with, my account can bear the mark of MX, spelt MX, a title indicating a non-binary identification, rather than Miss, Mrs, Ms. How that has come to pass as a social transition is a good question. Strictly speaking, though, it might not be a psychoanalytic question. Unlike the sociologist, the psychoanalyst's strict concern, and ultimately I'm all about loosening this strictness, but we haven't quite got there yet, so for now, the analyst's strict concern is with psychical reality, that register of experience and epistemology named by Freud precisely to advert to the ways in which the operating system of the unconscious differs radically from familiar functioning of everyday thought. The unconscious, a phantasmatic entity, securely hypothesized, though never directly encountered, and animated by a most peculiar set of rules. The happy coexistence of opposites, the subversion of linear narratives, the privileging of the part object, undermining the idea of a coherent whole, the die-hard principle of overdetermination, undermining singularity everywhere you look. The psychoanalyst has to adapt her thinking style in accordance with the object of her inquiry, which includes, of course, the unconscious production of fantasy. However, if the psychoanalyst can boast a special capacity for thinking the impossible, especially with regard to thought itself, if her thinking runs at odds with the categorising impulse of the either-or in favour of the more confusing both-and, there is one rather obvious exception to the rule: sexual difference. Why, we might well ask with Judith Butler, this exclusive focus on the fall into two-ness? Is it a necessary limit? Is it a blind spot in the theory? Might it be both and more, as well as a product of history? I'm sure we'll be returning to this question again and again over the next 2 days because it is an important question, but might I also suggest that it's rather a niche question. It's true that different disciplines have different thinking styles that accord with their objects of study. They also have different nomenclatures, comprised of specialist, sometimes sacred terms that don't necessarily travel well. In keeping with an interest in transdisciplinarity, one of the points I'm keen to make is that if psychoanalysis is to go on conversing effectively with others, it does need to question the sovereignty of its own vocabulary. And this might well entail having a less sovereign idea of its own identity as a discipline. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm going to share with you now a piece of video. This is a short clip from a feature on Newsnight entitled "Is Transgender the New Civil Rights Frontier?" Emily Maitlis, the interviewer in the middle here, is speaking with Sarah Dittam, feminist writer and journalist, seated on the left, and on the right, C.N. Lester, a musician and trans activist. The context for the piece is last year's reporting of the Transgender Equality Inquiry, an inquiry chaired by the Conservative MP Maria Miller on behalf of the government's Women and Equalities Committee. The recommendations of the report, however, are not what's most interesting in the clip we're about to watch. In fact, across the breadth of this conversation staged here, and I'm only going to be playing the shortest snippet from it, the inquiry's findings hardly get discussed at all. There seems to be something more urgent, more intractable, but also perhaps unnameable in this conversation. Let's have a watch.
Cian, how would you describe yourself if you're faced with a form or a passport or an application? What do you write?
I think for someone like me who is transgender but doesn't consider themselves either male or female and sort of goes through the world being treated as sometimes a man and sometimes a woman, it gets very confusing when I'm asked to accurately describe who I am. I want to tell the truth, I want to be honest about my experiences, and if a form simply has male or female, there's no way I can do that.
Why is it confusing? Why do you get sometimes described as a man and sometimes a woman?
I think it's because we have different ways of seeing gender, we have different ways of seeing sex and gender. If we look into the history of how we do gender and sex, we've always had very interesting ways, creative ways of doing gender. We've had people who transition from one sex to another. We have people who live in a space which is between genders. We have people who reject ideas of gender at all.
You were born a woman.
No, I was born a baby. I think there's quite a big distinction there. And in fact, because of the very patriarchal system in Hong Kong, I don't even have female on my birth certificate. I have girl, because it was very old-fashioned.
Can I jump in? Okay, so it's interesting that generated a laugh. We might want to see what we can make to that, really. The opening question there was one of self-description. If you're faced with a form, what do you write? CN then refers to the confusion felt when established lexical conventions do not permit them to tell the truth of their experiences. A marked example, we might suggest, of the failure of language to wholly represent the identity of the subject. Emily, the interviewer, with a thrice why is it confusing? Why do you get sometimes described as a man, sometimes a woman? Persists with a line of questioning intended, it seems to me, to elicit greater clarity, but that might possibly mean for her greater singularity. CN's response, which begins to outline the multiple ways in which people have done gender, is shortly interrupted by not a journalist's question as such, but a designating statement. You were born a woman, prefaced with a but you were born a woman, and followed by the smallest of pauses. I don't know if you caught it. Emily's face, she pauses for just a fraction of a second, followed by the smallest of pauses that leaves us to wonder whether Emily is catching on to her own rather significant category confusion. No, I was born a baby, replies CN, definitively, because this isn't a declaration that merits any ambiguity. Is it? Winnicott might have something different to say. When you break it down, there's an awful lot to read off from this brief bit of dialogue. I'm going to restrict myself to one thing. I'm going to focus on the citational charge of the designation, possibly accusation, but you were born a woman. Simone de Beauvoir is somewhere to be reckoned with here. Freud, in his 1933 paper, states as plainly as he can, psychoanalysis does not try to describe what a woman is. That would be a task it could scarcely perform, but sets into inquiring how she comes into being. The coming into being of woman. This is as close as Freud gets to offering his readers something that could be taken up and developed more in line with the types of readings of gender as a social construct broadly conceived, that proliferated in mid-20th century thought. But for reasons I'll come on to shortly, I certainly wouldn't want to go so far as to suggest that this is a genuine rehearsal on Freud's part of de Beauvoir's more canonical statement of 49, or indeed its influence. De Beauvoir's statement, then. We know it already, I'm sure. One is not born, but becomes a woman. As a formulation on the theme of becoming, this has acquired a self-evident status. All the more confusing, then, when its apparent facticity slips from view, as Emily Maitlis demonstrated for us. For what it's worth, I don't think Emily believes for a moment that one is born a woman, but nonetheless, she finds herself saying it, irrespective of whether she's read her Freud, read her Simone de Beauvoir, or for that matter, her Kate Bornstein, who, as Judith Butler observes, dramatically reworks de Beauvoir's legacy by demonstrating that the transformation of trans identities, the travellings beyond the binary framework, themselves become the meaning of gender. For us, given our likely familiarity with the crux of de Beauvoir's thesis, it might be worthwhile to consider the language surrounding the soundbite. Writing in 1949, don't forget, she goes on. No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and eunuch, which is described as feminine. This is interesting language for contemporary ears. Woman, as she has come to pass, we might say, is a figuration, a presentation that, and this is key for de Beauvoir, could have been otherwise. The human female was never predestined to become this intermediate creature that, in 1949, answers to the name woman. One of the things I'm interested in is whether and how some of the historical lines of fracture in long-standing conversations between psychoanalysis and different feminisms might be being restaged in present configurations of trans discourse. I'd like to pick up on this line of thought for just a moment or two. I suggested it would be misrepresentative to draw a straight line from the Freud of 1933 to social constructionist accounts of gender. Why so? As I often find myself reminding students, by the way, with admirable scepticism towards anything that sniffs of deterministic readings of identity, especially when passed down by dead white men. Freud didn't have the category of gender to work with. His attempts to forge a link between the anatomical and the psychological, as well as maintain a place for the social in his account of how a woman comes into being, required a longer gestation period than he was equipped to provide. Sometimes I think I underline this point as a sort of plea, the message being something like, please don't judge Freud purely because he couldn't make some of the lexical moves that we now take for granted. Endeavour instead to discern the thought work beneath, for example, his apparent conflation of activity and passivity with maleness and femaleness. Such a plea may well buy me a little more time in the classroom to demonstrate how the radical edge of Freud's theories of sexuality as subject formation, has dramatic implications for the possibilities of gender. However, I err if, when I remind my students that Freud didn't have the category of gender to work with, the implication stands that had Freud have had the category of gender to work with, he would have worked with it. He wouldn't. Or at least not in ways that easily map onto our current understandings of the term. I don't mean to suggest that Freud was uninterested or unsympathetic to the cultural framings of male and female psychology. He makes plenty of references to the social restrictions imposed on women, and more generally to how the so-called civilizing forces, education, morality, religion, are unreasonable, indeed hypocritical in their demands. However, the sum of his recognitions that woman is a socialized animal does not get us to the bottom line of his theory. We can develop this thought with reference to the Simone de Beauvoir citation, with a little help from Juliet Mitchell's enduringly helpful 74 text, Psychoanalysis and Feminism. In Mitchell's focused reading of The Second Sex, she highlights the following passage, in which de Beauvoir makes plain how her treatment of woman differs from what she regards to be the Freudian treatment. So, this is Mitchell quoting de Beauvoir. The I is de Beauvoir's. I shall pose the problem of feminine destiny quite otherwise than it is proposed by psychoanalysis. I shall place woman in a world of values and give her behaviour a dimension of liberty. I believe that she has the power to choose between the assertion of her transcendence and her alienation as object. She's not the plaything of contradictory drives. She devises solutions of diverse values in the ethical scale. Juliet Mitchell, takes this quotation and makes the point that, given de Beauvoir's investment in free choice and the quest of becoming, the existentialist philosopher is obliged to see the Freudian stress on the significance of anatomy and the notion of drives as crudely deterministic. However, for Mitchell, there's something intractable about what de Beauvoir identifies as woman's intermediariness, which is neither crudely deterministic nor indeed able to be transcended. We might recall that in the terms of de Beauvoir's prison, woman exists between a man and a eunuch. She's situated between a man and a man's opposite, though she herself is not man's opposite. I think this is important to stress. Considered in the context of psychoanalytic thought, moving back through Mitchell to Freud, we might say that the postulation of woman was never simply one pole of a male-female binary, a binary which some feminisms then worked to dissolve, but was itself originally indeterminate, less a simple category than the place where categorization flounders. Woman as a site where identity itself gets questioned. Having assured you at the top of my paper that my theme was confusion, I suspect I may be delivering on my promise. Let me change tack somewhat and move from the intermediariness of woman to the transitoriness of woman. If, as I've suggested, psychoanalysis poses woman as a question, that's not to say that we must constantly be asking it. After all, we also have to live. And living requires a kind of conviction as well as questioning, a conviction from which comes all the automations, the routines and second nature habits, the practical masteries that comprise the practice of living, the practices of selfhood. So having queried womanhood, now I want to wonder what it means to get on with the necessary business of living, which is not living as a woman necessarily. In her instructive text, Am I That Name? Feminism and the Category of Women in History, feminist theorist and poet Denise Riley investigates the ambiguity, the inescapable indeterminacy of the category women. Although hers isn't a work that foregrounds trans subjectivities, her hypothesis that women are only sometimes women resonates strongly, I think, with the politics of transition, where transition must be thought of in temporal terms as well as in identity terms. In other words, from moment to moment. To quote, "Women only sometimes live in the flesh distinctively of women, as it were, and this is a function of historical categorizations as well as of an individual daily phenomenology." Riley observes that it's not possible to live 24 hours a day soaked in the immediate awareness of one's sex. Gendered self-consciousness, mercifully, has a flickering nature, she writes. Now, could this be the complacency of cis privilege speaking? I don't think so. We can easily accept that for some, more so than for others, and of course, for all at some times more than at other times, the flickering nature of gendered, or is that sexed, self-consciousness threatens to become a full-on glare. However, coping with the fact of having a human body, which is a body of flesh and word, necessitates periods of quietude from its self-consciousness. Minimally, sleep, wherein we get both to rest and to dream ourselves otherwise. I take this to be something of Riley's point. As an aside, we can observe that in terms of her sentence construction here, the second quotation, Riley's indicating that awareness of one's sex is contiguous with gendered self-consciousness. She slides between sex and gender, in other words. The more important point that I want to underscore, though, is that the motif of flickering is a temporal one. Some kind of rhythm analysis is required to understand the on and offness, the more and lessness of this sexed self-consciousness. I'd like to borrow from Riley what she offers as two exemplary moments, transitory scenes, if you like, in which women's consciousness of the sex-gender system, to deploy Gail Rubin's preferred coinage, is liable to flash up or to flicker on. Both these scenes speak to the everyday situation of not knowing you're a woman, and then suddenly being made to know. In the first, it's a matter of menstruation. To be caught out by the start of menstruation, by the leakage of blood, that means that the sovereignty exercised by your hormonal cycle has gone and done it again. In the second, it's a shout from the street. You walk down a street wrapped in your own speculations, or you speed up, hell-bent on getting to the shops before they close. A car slows down, a shout comments on your expression, your movement, or there's a derisively hissed remark from the pavement. In each of these cases, the embodied subject is somehow called into an awareness of their being a woman. The first, and potentially this is a scene with just one person in it, is a single individual with a human body that menstruates. I don't think the point here is simply to re-moor the category women into biological or hormonal logics. There is no inevitable tie between the leakage of blood and the flickering on of a person's sexed self-consciousness. As Riley explains, you might view this badly timed event as being taken up or thrown down into your sex, but you need not do so. The second scene is a familiar gendered hailing event, where, as in the theory of interpolation, the speech act from the other is the trigger for flicking the switch of gendered awareness from dim to bright. Again, however, the determination is ambiguous. We can easily acknowledge, in fact we must acknowledge, that for different people it will mean a different thing to be interpolated as woman. The placement of these two scenes side by side encourages us to consider an important idea, I think, the idea of the sometimes woman. At first glance, Riley's examples might look like they're repeating the old nature-nurture juxtaposition. The call of nature in the first example, the call of a man in the second, the call of man in the second. Attendant upon this, it might look like we have a recapitulation of the split between sex and gender between these two scenes. However, it's neither Riley's concern nor my own to reinforce a sex-gender distinction. My paper's worked in the opposite direction, I hope. Rather, taking Riley's lead, I want to point out that as interpolations, interruptions, or intrusions, both these scenes exemplify equally the temporalisation of being a woman, which is to say, of all women, they are only sometimes woman. Womanhood is transitory. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to conclude hastily. In this paper, I've extracted intermediariness and transitoriness as values which attach themselves to the question of woman, or woman as a question of sex and gender, both in the psychoanalytic tradition, but also in the phenomenological terrain of the body in everyday life. My offering to the conference, emerging from my request at the outset that we take confusion seriously, that we allow ourselves to be confused, is the suggestion of value, and for some, I think, the experience of relief in not always knowing whether one is, in fact, a woman. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I think that was the perfect way to kick off our thinking today. We have 7 minutes for questions. So Ivan has a microphone, and I'd like to welcome questions.
Julie, really enjoyed your talk and really loved the whole idea of transitory lines through sexuality and gender. And I was just wondering if the term fluidity would be more workable to allow possibilities of, well, whichever position an individual wants to take. And I'm particularly thinking of the work of Lisa Diamond, who's done a lot of sociological work on that, trying to suggest that sexualities are fluid and we need to work with that fluidity, particularly in the trans realm, where there is always this pressure to say, have you transitioned to a man, and are you male to female or female to male? And maybe they're just people. So I just wondered what you thought about the idea of fluidity as a way of also bringing in the libido.
I was entirely with you until the end. Libido kind of does that sometimes, doesn't it? Shunts you off course. Yeah, fluidity. I mean, it's a prevalent and important term. I'm tempted to try and respond, but I know I'm going to fail in doing so, by saying fluidity is there to be used as a descriptor for identities. One of the points I've been making is that, you know, let's sanction fluidity, of course. It's going to be fluid. You know, it's going to mean different things to different people. And I'm not sure that... I suspect it probably describes something that people are more inclined to talk of in gender terms than this problem that I've raised but not solved around sexual difference. So where fluidity comes into in sexual difference is a different question than presentations of gender. Already I'm dissatisfied with my response, so I'm going to curtail it.
The reason I mentioned libido at the end was because I think there's a lot of pressure, particularly for trans people, to talk of themselves in terms of gender, because that's a more sanitised way of talking about what they're actually feeling in terms of their unconscious and their libidinal drive.
Yeah.
And that's why I threw it in at the end. It's kind of, why can't they talk about sexuality? You know, why can't they talk about their sexuality as they experience it? And so they have to turn into this kind of, well, you know, let's be gender correct about it all and let's fight the battlefront there. And what I'm finding is that it's silencing what's actually going on in unconscious process or choices of libido. Yeah. So that was where the fluidity thing.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Completely naive question. Forgive me for the moment if I attribute to you the status of a woman for the moment. Are you contending that I ideally would say, how would you prefer that I address you, seeing that you might reject that category? And to what degree does that make conversation and communication more problematic?
I think conversation, communication is problematic, whatever. And I think this question is so individually answered. I mean, I can answer for myself, but then it's a real so what moment. You know, you can address me as you did. Fine. Yeah, I'm struggling to say a bit more on that than what I've given you there. Not a great response, sorry.
There was a question over here. It should be on.
So to follow up on the idea of temporality, you mentioned this idea of a woman walking down the street and it's registered to her that she's a woman because she gets some abuse from a car. I understand the idea of it being temporal, that it's registered, but if we exist within a social structure, then her subject position as a woman is consistent and she's going to be subject to that. So it's a temporal registration, but do you think there's anything beyond that that is not quite so temporal? And then just to pick up on the idea of fluidity, if things like gender, like sexuality are highly constituted and we can accept that they're discursive, it's still in a way that's not completely limitless. So what do you think the limitations are to this idea of fluidity?
Okay, so in terms of the interpolation, I think the theory is kind of, or at least as I was using it from Riley's illustration, the theory there is to say something about the intrusion of an awareness, as you say, a registration of something. So we're talking there about the sometimes woman, that at that moment, like you've forgotten what you are, and it's reminded to you forcefully. You know, that can stand, and then we can say an awful lot more around subject positions and, you know, structural inequality and measures of oppression that don't have that flickering nature. So I take that point, but I'm really attracted to the idea of the temporalizing womanhood. I think it's an important one. And then back to the question of fluidity. Well, help me out with how you wanted to push the term of fluidity, and I'm going to kind of push it into the room rather than take responsibility for myself, because we're tight for time, and it clearly seems one that's going to remain a question. So how did you want to push this idea?
What's the boundary for fluidity? What's its limitations? It's a very popular idea that gender is highly constituted, therefore it's not, you know, completely changeable, say, from day to day. It may well be over time, but the idea that, you know, things are discursive, it doesn't mean that they're limitlessly discursive.
Yeah. So this, you're kind of articulating a critique that's readily made of some of Judith Butler's earlier work around the idea that performativity, for example, and gender fluidity is somehow voluntaristic. And I think this is where we need to remember the unconscious, and that the unconscious being the kind of sticking point that means things sometimes aren't fluid, things are obstinate and intractable. Shall we, because I think you've raised something more articulately than I'm responding to it, so I think we should let that remain in the conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Julie.